Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at if the Craftworld Eldar Phoenix Lords have any real synergy with their own aspects, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what synergies actually exist between the Phoenix Lords and Craftworld Eldar units of any kind, as well as in relation to their own aspect warriors. And it works a little bit differently now because essentially every Phoenix Lord gives their own aspect warriors +2 leadership and objective secured now instead of other abilities, which they used to give their aspect warriors. So back in the day, Phoenix Lords would often give buffs to their own aspect warriors in their army. However, nowadays, they don't really do that. They only give the +2 leadership and objective secured. So what we're going to be looking at in this video particularly is the Craftworld Eldar Phoenix Lords and their synergy with their own aspect warriors. And then we're going to be talking about which other units the Phoenix Lords have the most synergy with, if not with their own aspect warriors. So let's get right into it. So the first Phoenix Lord that we're going to be looking at is Jane Czar and her synergy with her Howling Banshees. So like all Phoenix Lords, she gives her Howling Banshees +2 leadership and objective secured. And this isn't that great on combat units, to be honest, because combat units typically aren't going to be wasting time performing actions or holding objectives. So objective secured isn't really the best ability for holding those objectives down. They could be used to take objectives away from enemy units, but again, objective secured really isn't going to help too much with this because if you charge a unit of, like, let's say Howling Banshees into a unit that's on an objective and you kill them all, well, objective secured isn't really going to help you that much in that case, right? Either the Howling Banshees are then going to be shot to death and killed, or they're going to stay there and nothing's going to challenge them. So either way, that's not that helpful. And also, Jane Czar has a special ability where she reduces the attacks of enemies within her engagement range by 1. And this is okay, but typically the types of enemies that Banshees are going to want to fight are not going to survive to fight back. Things like Space Marines and mech equivalent enemies just aren't going to be able to dish out the amount of attacks back anyway, because most of them are going to be dead. So there's not a lot of synergy there. And in fact, as I've argued in another video, the Howling Banshee Exarch, actually with the Piercing Strikes Exarch power, has comparable damage to Jane Czar against mech equivalent enemies with 2 wounds. So what that essentially means is that the Banshees themselves don't really need the support of Jane Czar, and a lot of the abilities and buffs that Jane Czar gives are a little bit redundant on Banshees. However, I believe that Jane Czar works the best with Striking Scorpions, Wraithblades, and Shining Spears, basically other close combat units in our army. And the reason being is because the first thing she does is obviously she gives the Banshee Mask ability, which forces enemies to strike last, meaning they cannot use the counteroffensive stratagem to kill your unit before they can strike. And that's basically one of the best ways for your opponent to get an attack in on your Eldar assault troops is by using this stratagem. Now, it is expensive. It is 2 command points. But if you want to charge into anything that's close combat oriented, they're going to easily be able to use that to counter you very quickly and end up killing your unit. Again, Eldar units cannot stand up to much firepower or many attacks in close combat. So counteroffensive is a real big counter to a lot of our squishier combat units that don't have that Banshee Mask. But Jane Czar provides this so that when she charges in with, let's say, Wraithblades or something like that, she can allow those Wraithblades to strike before the enemy strikes, get their attacks in first, and thus stop the enemy from using this stratagem. And this is especially effective with Wraithblades in particular because it makes them even better at staying alive in combat with the -1 attack debuff in addition. This allows units of Wraithblades to stay in combat even longer against tough, close combat-oriented enemy units, things like Terminators, I know that, for example, the new Chaos Space Marine Codex has some pretty nasty Terminators who are really good in close combat. Wraith Blades with Force Shields and Ghost Axes, with the support of Jane Czar, can definitely take these guys on and win several engagements, no matter what they're equipped with. And it's because of this combination of -1 attack, but also being forced to strike last, which is probably the better thing, because Chaos Terminators, if they are charged, could easily use counteroffensive and kill your Wraith Guard before you get the chance to strike. But being able to strike first, and also them being at -1 attack, is going to allow you to win and probably kill them in a couple rounds of combat. And Jane Czar is equally good with Shining Spears and Striking Scorpions, because she simply allows for this ability to where Shining Spears and Striking Scorpions don't have to worry about getting counter-offensived, or basically being counter-struck, right? So Shining Spears, they're one of their biggest weaknesses as well as this, because if they choose to charge into a close combat unit like Terminators, for 2 command points, those Terminators are going to wipe those Shining Spears off the face of the planet. So having Jane Czar go in there first, deny them the ability to actually use this stratagem, is very effective at keeping them alive and making sure that their damage goes through. And next up is the old Fuegan and his synergy with Fire Dragons. So he does give them +2 leadership and objective secured, but this is not going to be used often, as Fire Dragons often won't be in a position to actually perform actions and hold objectives at the same time while killing tanks and monsters. It's just not going to happen. And with Fire Dragons, you do not want to waste their time performing actions and holding objectives. It's just not their job. Their job is to kill tanks, and Fuegan does nothing to help them do that. Fire Dragons also don't really want to be in close combat, and Fuegan has a lot of combat-oriented abilities and stats, which actually encourage him to get into combat with enemy units and vehicles or monsters. However, even though Fuegan doesn't have that much synergy with his own aspect, he does have a lot of synergy with Dire Avengers. And the reason why is because, and I kind of went over this in another video of mine recently, but Fuegan's beam weapon profile, if positioned correctly, can actually help Dire Avengers proc the Avengers of Azurian stratagem, which is extremely powerful. It essentially kills one Dire Avenger, and in exchange, the Dire Avengers will be eligible to use the Avengers of Azurian stratagem, which means as long as they're below their starting strength, they can shoot twice that turn. So pretty powerful. And he can also provide combat support and a bit of anti-tank damage to the Dire Avengers, who aren't the best at killing tanks outside of Hail of Doom lists, so this is a welcome buff. So Fuegan actually does do fairly well with Dire Avengers, believe it or not. And then we have Morgan Raw and his synergy with Dark Reapers. So this is something that a subscriber brought up to me a little bit ago, and they said that basically they were really disappointed in Morgan Raw with Dark Reapers, and that they didn't have a very good experience with those models. Now, I'm just going to say this right off the bat before we get into their possible synergies. Morgan Raw is one of those Phoenix Lords that really has never had that much synergy with Dark Reapers, and I remember playing way back in 5th and 4th edition where Morgan Raw was basically not taken at all. And if he was taken because he had this kind of ability to stay alive and be put in friendly units. Because I don't know if any of you guys remember, but back in the day, if you took a special character, or any character for that matter, you could attach those characters to units. So Morgan Raw was really never brought with Dark Reapers. He was always attached to some other unit. He's never actually had real synergy with Dark Reapers. He has a very different weapon than Dark Reapers do. It has a different range. Dark Reapers have 48 range. He has 36. And to be honest with you, his weapon doesn't do a whole lot of damage itself, and it doesn't really increase the Dark Reapers damage, and that's their primary role. Dark Reapers' primary role is to do damage at range, right? So Mongan Ra doesn't really help them with this. And if anything, putting Mongan Ra next to a unit of Dark Reapers is just going to make them a bigger target. So you really don't want to do that. I think he probably has one of the least amounts of synergy with his aspect along with Fuegan because of these reasons. And even though he gives objective secured and +2 leadership to Dark Reapers, the +2 leadership really will never matter because Dark Reapers can't be taken in squads higher than 5. And the objective secured isn't really that good either because if Dark Reapers are trying to hold down objectives, they're not shooting, they're not performing what they basically need to do, their main role. And again, being on an objective often makes you more vulnerable to enemy shooting and things like that. So overall, even though Mongan Ra and Dark Reapers are very similar thematically and they belong to the same aspect shrine, they're really not good together rules-wise and they have very little synergy with each other. So if you are going to run these two units together, I would recommend not running them on the same part of the board or expecting that they are going to have any sort of synergy with each other because they really just don't. And again, for those of you who want to make Mongan Ra and Dark Reapers work together, my advice would be also to make sure to debuff enemy units with things like Reveal and Jinx. This will go a long way towards improving their overall damage and making them a more potent ranged threat for your enemy to deal with. And to be honest with you, Mongan Ra is really not good with many units. And the reason being is because he has a very awkward role in that he doesn't do a whole lot of range damage, but he also isn't really great in combat. So in a lot of ways, he's actually worse than a lot of the other Phoenix Lords. However, he does synergize well with Rangers, and here's the reason why. There's a couple different reasons for it. The first reason is because he really needs a cheap way to get Lookout Sir at range, because he is going to be shooting quite frequently, and you're not always going to be able to dip behind obscuring terrain, right? Some things will ignore it, and even though he does or is a Phoenix Lord, he's still going to be suffering damage from long-range weapons if they can draw a line of sight to him, right? And this guy is too expensive and too large of an investment of points to really just throw away, right? So he does need to stick around something in the backfield, and Rangers are that unit. They have the same range as him at 36, so they're going to be basically shooting at the same targets. Rangers allow him to get a cheap Lookout Sir so they can be a little bit protected, but also he makes the Rangers a little bit harder to remove by providing a decent combat ability to keep cheap assault troops away from the Rangers and provides them decent supporting fire when they're performing actions. So Rangers really like to be performing actions a lot of the times and holding objectives, and Mongan Ra is a really good way to kind of, well, essentially deter enemy units from getting near them, right? So he's pretty good in that sense. He can also be used in combination with a webway portal to provide a very hard to hit target that can stay on a webway gate pretty much the entire game, benefit from Lookout Sir by being near Rangers, and also help you score on the hidden path secondary objective, which if you have a webway gate is one of the better secondary objectives that you can score points on in matched play. So even though he's not really that great with a lot of units, he does work fairly well with Rangers. And they also benefit from him as well because they don't need that much combat support, but Mongan Ra basically gives just enough to deter cheap enemy units from trying to kill the Rangers. So things like your basic assault marines, things like that might deep strike in to take out a unit of Rangers, might find it a lot harder to do so with Mongan Ra around. And then, of course, we have Baroth and his synergy with Swooping Hawks. So, unlike the other Phoenix Lords that we've talked about so far, I actually think that Baroth is extremely good with Swooping Hawks, and the reason being is because him being able to give objectives secured to them is actually pretty good. Because Swooping Hawks are an objective-centric unit that can basically be anywhere on the board at any time with their Skyleap ability. And a lot of missions in matched play have bonuses for objective-secured units performing actions and taking objectives on the field. So being able to use objective secured on Swooping Hawks and being able to save yourself a psychic power with the Will of Azurian, being able to cast out on something else, is extremely helpful. And not to mention, but Barath is actually also pretty good by himself. He can actually use the Cloud Strider ability to assault and then hop back near a unit of Swooping Hawks to provide them objective secured on the next turn. So, needless to say, Barath works best with Swooping Hawks. He provides them objective secured, which makes them really versatile in scoring on objectives and performing actions in many of the Nephilim missions. And again, other than that, Barath works great as a solo act. He can jump in and out of combat and then Cloud Strike back to safety or on objectives, of which he also has objective secured himself. And he can also give these to Swooping Hawks as well. So, very good Phoenix Lord still, very competitive and very good with Swooping Hawks. If you do have a unit of Swooping Hawks that go along with them, he can be used to give them objective secured basically whenever he feels like it or whenever you need it. And on to Kahandras and his synergy with Striking Scorpion. So Kahandras is an interesting Phoenix Lord. He's very powerful in close combat, very good. But the problem is he doesn't have a lot of synergy with Striking Scorpions. And the reason why is because he essentially just does the same thing that they do, a little bit better, right? He is a character, so he does have a little bit more powerful weapons and so forth. He essentially is just going to do the same thing. And because of this, him giving +2 leadership and objective secured isn't that great, especially on most combat units, because they're not going to be wanting to perform actions or hold objectives. Very much similar to Janezar and the Howling Banshees. However, I do think Kahandras is a little bit better than Janezar with Striking Scorpions because of this one thing, and that is, if deployed using advanced positions with Striking Scorpions, having objective secured can be very useful for performing actions in the very early stages of the game. However, again, after the early stages of the game, your Striking Scorpions are really going to be wanting to get in combat with other units. They're not going to be wanting to sit back and perform actions and things like this. So it's not that great. I do think it has some uses in the early turns of the game where there's no good targets. But later on in the game, it's, again, same problem as Janezar, just not really that effective. And just like Janezar, I think Kahandras actually works best when charging in with Wraithblades, or being used in conjunction with Wraithblades. And the reason why I say this is because it does seem like an odd unit to synergize with, but if you think about it a little bit, Kahandras does a great job at helping Wraithblades deal with two of their biggest issues. One, hordes of infantry, which he can wreck because he has the, I think it's called the Ismithil, something like that. But it's basically a biting blade that gives him double attacks, which can just mow down infantry units. And he also deals well with units with invulnerable saves because he does have the Scorpion's Bite, which for every 6 to roll to wound that he gets 2 mortal wounds in addition. So he's really good at dealing with invul saves and hordes of infantry, which are two of the Wraithblade's biggest issues. And on top of that, Kahandras is very good at character assassination. He can take characters out very quickly, and characters often are the bearers of things like mortal wounds and high AP attacks, which Wraithblades also have trouble dealing with. So he's very good at killing those kind of targets, and that's why I think, to be honest, Kahandras probably works best with Wraithblades or on his own as a single character. And lastly, we have Azurman. So Azurman's synergy with Dire Avengers is pretty good because giving objective secured to Dire Avengers is actually one of the best things that you can do. And the reason being is because this is a unit that has a lot of objective power as well as offensive power. So they already have an ability where they can shoot without the action failing if they're performing an action, which if you're playing match play, a lot of your infantry units are going to be performing actions throughout the game. So having objectives secured on top of this, when you're performing actions on top of objectives, is extremely useful because you can have objectives secured. You can perform an action without your shooting it, well, basically without it failing if you shoot. And that is very effective. And he also has really good combat ability and shooting, which allows him to support Dire Avengers on objectives very well. So needless to say, Azurman works best with his own aspect, which is Dire Avengers. Not only does he give Dire Avengers objectives secured, but he also provides them good combat support against more threatening targets, things like Terminators that Dire Avengers won't be able to beat in close combat. If a unit of Terminators gets into close combat with your Dire Avengers, you can use Heroic Intervention to have a Azurman hop in there, and you can use the counter-offensive stratagem to be able to mow down a couple of those Terminators before they are able to strike back. And his Sword of Azur is extremely powerful and can definitely kill several Terminators in combat in one round of combat. So very strong. He's also really good at shooting. He has 6 shots at a medium distance at 24 inches, and he's pretty durable with his 3+ invul save. And the cool thing about his shooting attacks, actually, believe it or not, is they have damage too. So he actually does some really good damage against infantry and can help support a Dire Avenger unit that is on an objective, perform their action, shoot, and also be defended from things like assaults as well. So all in all, I think Azurman is probably best used in conjunction with his own aspect warriors. So in conclusion, I think that most Phoenix Lords essentially have almost no synergy with their aspect warriors and are often better used with other units to maximize their effectiveness. Now, this wasn't always the case. I think in past editions, Phoenix Lords did give significant buffs to their own aspects, but in this case, they really just don't. However, both Barath and Azurman have a lot of synergy with their own aspects in regards to objective play and support that make them very powerful when used together. And I think essentially this boils down to that ability giving objective secured to a unit is going to be obviously more effective with units that are already playing the objective game. Dire Avengers and Swooping Hawks are both units that are pretty good at playing to the objectives, so needless to say, the Phoenix Lords who give objective secured to their own aspects, and if those aspects are good at objective play already, it's just going to make them even better. These are the ones that they're going to synergize best with, which is why Barath and Azurman are basically the best Phoenix Lords to be paired with their own aspects. Now, I'm not saying all the other aspects are terrible. A few are, I'll be honest, but they just don't synergize that well with their aspects. So Jane Czar and Kahandras, while very good and very good with other units, they're just not good with their own aspect warriors because they make them a little bit redundant and they don't provide them with any real abilities. Having objective secured on combat units isn't that great. So Jane Czar and Kahandras, while very good and very good with other units, they're just not good with their own aspect warriors because they make them a little bit redundant and they don't provide them with any real abilities. Having objective secured on combat units isn't that great because combat units want to move on from objectives quickly and engage enemy units, well, in combat, right? They don't want to be holding objectives. They're not really good at it because they have no long-range attacks. So overall, again, like I said, I think that for the most part, if you are running a combat-oriented Phoenix Lord, they're best used with other units. Because a lot of their weapons and stuff like that are kind of redundant. Like, for example, the Banshee Mask of Jane Czar and just regular Banshees, they basically do the same thing. Jane Czar negates one attack, but it's not that much of a difference. Same thing with Kahandras, right? Kahandras does a lot of what regular striking Scorpions do anyway. So they don't have a lot of synergy with each other. Now, when talking about the lower tier Phoenix Lords, Fuegan and Morgan Ra. And both of those Phoenix Lords don't really synergize a whole lot with their own aspect warriors because they just do slightly different roles. Fuegan being much better with Dire Avengers to proc Avengers of Azurian, and Morgan Ra being much better with Rangers to get cheap objectives secured and access to Lookout Sir in the backfield where he will be holding down objectives and helping the Rangers basically perform actions and things like that. So that's going to be it for today's video on the Phoenix Lords and some of the possible synergies they might have with other aspect warrior units in their armies. And there are a lot of other synergies that Phoenix Lords do have that I didn't go into in this video. And if you guys know a synergy that has worked well for you, please let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear what you guys have to say about the different units that work well with the Phoenix Lords that you've chosen to run in your games. All right, everybody. So that's going to be it for today's video. And I am aware that there is some background noise occasionally in my recordings. I've been kind of aware of this for a while. I live in an apartment, so it's a little bit difficult to get a really quiet place when there's a street right outside of your window where there's cars passing by your window every couple seconds. But I am trying to figure out a way to get rid of that background noise. And I know it was a little rainy during this recording, so you may hear some rain in the background, and I do apologize for that ahead of time. All right, everybody, that's going to be it. Peace out. See you guys next time. And like I said before, please do leave a comment in the comment section if there are any synergies with the Phoenix Lords that you have found in your own games. Have a good one, everybody. See you guys later.